Well, good morning. It's good for me to see you, but really you're just seeing me. I don't know. It's good to be with you all this morning. In some of these past devotionals in these months, one of the things that I have done is I've presented to you some of the resources that I have liked and that I've used. They've been a couple different podcasts. A lot of them have been around this topic of how to pray and be in God's presence on a daily basis, how to pray the daily office in the Episcopal tradition, and those kinds of things. I want to share another one with you today, and that is from an organization called Mockingbird. Let me see there. This is one of their journals. Mockingbird is definitely a journal of creative, thoughtful, spiritual reflection and writing. But it's also a host of things. They've got a website called mbird.com, and on it they've got some kind of daily fresh content, and they've got some podcasts. A lot of them sort of centered around parenting, and they also do something that I really like. They have a monthly playlist of music, and which that I connect really well with music. I really like that a lot. But the center of their ministry is that they want to do some writing and thinking about life and faith and life with Christ that is all centered around this core gift that God gives us, and that's the gift of grace. That most of us are living a life where we're pursuing love and value through our performance for what we can do right. And that what we often find most of the time is that we can't achieve that kind of perfection. And that at the heart of the gospel, the heart of the good news of Jesus is the grace that God wants to give us. And so Mockingbird, their creative life is all centered around this idea of living into God's grace. So I highly recommend it to you. I want to read to you from the latest journal, and this journal that came, each one sort of has a theme, and this is the theme of this last one. It is to care and not to care. And so in it, there is a writer named Luke Stone, and he submitted the eulogy that he wrote at his mother's passing. Luke Stone, this is for his mother, and I found it to be really poignant, and I wanted to share it with you. When I reflect on our mother, the phrase that I keep coming back to is, it's complicated. Our mother was a complicated, loving, often conflicted person who thrived in a loving family and also struggled with some very serious demons. You all knew our mom in many different capacities, many of those tied to this church and to the youth in it. Many of you were all touched in many ways by her devotion to children, by her selfless giving of her time and energy, and by her enthusiasm. Some of you were also hurt by her too. Our mother could be the most enthusiastic, hopeful person in the room, but she could also be sullen, reclusive, and pessimistic. It's complicated. Our mother participated in many mission trips with the church, took in exchange students in her home, and generally loved a wide variety of people, particularly children, and especially those less fortunate than herself. Many of those lives she touched, I'm sure, reminded her of her own childhood. And yet, our mother could also be judgmental of people and had a hard time seeing how challenging circumstances can affect people's decision-making capacity or their places in life. It's complicated. Our mother taught us the grace of Jesus Christ, and yet she could hold a grudge for months and perceive even the smallest slights deeply to the point of where she could not let them go. Our mother loved people deeply and built many lasting friendships, and yet I don't believe that she ever learned to love herself. It's complicated. Our mother sought approval from almost everyone she came in contact with. And though we all loved her deeply, if imperfectly, she could never receive it. The woman that you knew was often very conflicted beneath the surface. You see, she was a complicated person. Now, I don't tell you these things because I want you to have a final negative impression of our mom. I'm simply telling you this because this is who she was. Most of you probably already know this. Maybe some of you were wondering and thinking about various interactions that you had with her in the past, what was going on. Maybe she will make a little bit more sense to you now. Our mother was a wonderful mom. She loved us deeply. She supported us. She encouraged us. She cared for us when we needed a shoulder to cry on. She inspired us when we needed motivation to carry on, and she scolded us when we needed that too. The four of us were born on second base, and we did not hit a double to get there. We were put there, in large part, by the loving devotion of our mother. She did all this despite not having had someone to show her how to do it herself. She didn't have a mother that loved her, that inspired her, that cared for her, that put her needs first. Our mom was an abused child, and yet she was not an abuser. She was unloved and unwanted, and yet she loved us with her whole heart. And she wanted nothing more than to help her children be happy, thriving people. You see, it's complicated. Somehow, with God's grace, she broke a cycle of violence and neglect as she raised and cared for my siblings and me. Her grandchildren are completely free from that legacy. Cycles of violence, cycles of poverty, and cycles of abuse are topics that are hard to talk about, and they make people uncomfortable. But they are many people's deep reality, and these cycles influence who they are for their whole lives. She also didn't do that by herself. There were a lot of wonderful people in her life that loved her and cared for her like a mother, like the family that she wasn't born into, and helped her overcome those circumstances. She met my father, who loved her deeply, who was completely devoted to her and cared for her until the day that she died. But here, today, as we say goodbye to her, she deserves to be honored for breaking those cycles of violence and neglect. So, what is the legacy? What is the legacy that my mother leaves? What will I think about when I think of her? Well, you can see that part of her legacy in her grandchildren's enthusiasm for her life, their energy, and their feistiness. But more than that, the biggest thing that we will take away from our mother is that life and the people in it are complicated. If you don't think the people you love are complicated, you probably don't know them well enough. She was an imperfect person who loved us imperfectly, and yet she kept on loving. The last 2 years in our family have been extraordinarily painful and difficult, caused in large part by the decisions that she made. But life is so much more than just 2 years. That is but a small window in time of a life that encompassed so much more. And so I think what our mother showed us most of all was how to be an imperfect person, trying as hard as she could to love imperfect people imperfectly. And after all, isn't that what we all are anyway? I don't believe that God intends for us to love perfect people. I look out and I don't see any of those. And honestly, what would be the point in loving something that was perfect? How hard is that? And heaven knows that we're not capable of loving people perfectly. So what we're left with is being imperfect. and loving other imperfect people imperfectly. And when I consider our mother, her whole life, what she dedicated herself to, that's what I see. She always believed in a God who, no matter how difficult life's challenges or how bad one's circumstances, would never abandon her, would always love her, and would bring her home to be with him. That deep faith, it drove her to share that with us. It drove her to spend time here with the youth of this church. And it drove her to go out into the world on trips to share that with people out there. It drove her to be the person that she was. A complicated, broken, imperfect person, trying hard, but imperfectly, to love other imperfect people, and made whole again by the grace of God.